Welcome back. This is session 5. In the last session, we talked about empathy and perception. In this session, we're going to focus on social skills and how setting boundaries is an important part of having social skills. Boundaries are a form of self-care and a way of valuing ourselves. It's a way to take care of our physical, emotional, and even spiritual needs. Without adequate boundaries, we run the risk of allowing other people to treat us poorly or use us or take advantage of us. We use boundaries to teach other people how to treat us. It also allows others to know what to expect from us and what we expect from them. A boundary is like having an invisible line that tells people how much influence they can have over our own physical space, our needs and wants, or our emotions and responsibilities. Before we can establish appropriate boundaries, though, we must first know our own limits and what we're willing to accept from people. Being able to accurately assess our own limits and capabilities requires emotional intelligence. Assessing our physical capacity is more clear than assessing our emotional capacity. In terms of our physical capacity, some examples could be somebody asking to borrow money or help them move, volunteer our time, or maybe attend an event. This is more clear because we either have the money to let them borrow or we don't. We either have the time to help them or we don't. If we happen to be out of town or have something else already scheduled on the day they ask us to attend their event, it's a lot easier to say no. However, let's say we are available that day. Do we automatically say yes just because we're physically available that day? Many people would say yes, even if they didn't want to. And we do this out of feelings of guilt or obligation. Now, if the guilt and obligation is, in fact, your internal moral compass telling you that it's the right thing to do, because maybe that person has been there to support you in the past and now it's your turn to support them, then it probably is the right thing to do. But a lot of times, guilt is not our moral compass. It's just guilt. Guilt over our own insecurities of saying no, or of having people judge us for saying no, or having them not like us anymore, or for disappointing them. But what about disappointing ourselves? A lot of times we end up putting other people's needs ahead of our own. Now, this is okay to do at times, especially with relationships we value and relationships that are two-way streets where we help each other. But we do need to assess our emotional capacity. Just because we're physically able to do something doesn't mean we should. We also need to make sure that we are emotionally capable as well. Assessing our emotional capability is a bit more ambiguous and subjective and requires greater emotional intelligence. When we're going through a difficult time in our lives, like having a problem with our spouse or kids, there's extra stress at work, or maybe a death of a loved one, most, if not all, of our emotional capacity is being used to deal with our own needs and wants, which means we have less capacity to help others with theirs. At times like this, it's usually best to take care of ourselves first, because if we're not okay, how can we help others? We can't give what we don't have, so it's important to assess our emotional capacity before saying yes. But boundaries aren't just about saying yes or no. Boundaries can look different for different people, depending on our relationship with them and how badly they're crossing our boundaries. For people who are generally kind and respectful, we may not have to establish any boundaries. Boundaries are usually only needed when people continue to cross our boundaries in a way that hurts us. I always recommend going the path of least resistance first. We can always ask the person gently and politely for what we need from them and explain why it bothers us or affects us. If their behavior continues, we can remind them of our boundaries or even tell them our needs in a more assertive manner. If the behavior still continues, then it may be necessary to implement our own boundaries. So let's talk about what boundaries can look like. And remember, they can look different for each person depending on how much you're willing to tolerate from them. In keeping with the path of least resistance, we can start with easy, more subtle boundaries, and we can always make them more strict if needed. The goal is not to reprimand or punish the person. The goal is to take care of our own well-being by not engaging or participating in their hurtful behavior. We can establish boundaries by speaking up for ourselves, communicating our needs and wants, limiting how we help people, or limiting our time and interaction with them. Let's go through a few examples. If you have a family member that drains your energy or always finds a way to upset you when you talk to them, you may have to set a boundary for yourself to talk to them less often or for less time. Or maybe you just keep the conversation surface or text them rather than having a phone conversation. If you have a friend that, say, tends to be very opinionated and judgmental about your partner, then maybe you don't talk to them anymore about your partner. If your boss always expects you to work late, you may decide to limit those days and tell them you can only stay late on certain days, or request to come in later so you can stay later, or talk to them about ways of delegating the workload, or better yet, request a raise to compensate you for the extra work you do. When you go visit family, you may find that the first few days are great, but after that, it becomes a little stressful. So you may decide to limit how many days you stay, or stay at a nearby hotel rather than their house, or plan to do a few things on your own away from the house to give yourself and them a break. You may have a son or daughter who is rude and disrespectful at times. For them, your boundary may be to end the conversation when that happens, or limit ways you help them until they can be more respectful to you. If an argument with your spouse gets too heated, your boundary may be to walk away or leave the house until the situation calms down, and only agree to talk about the problem when they can talk more calmly. The point is, we don't have to accept people treating us poorly. We also don't have to take responsibility or accept blame for the emotions or behavior of others. And the same goes for us. We need to take responsibility for our own emotions and behavior and not blame others. It's important that we lead by example and treat others as we want them to treat us. People can blame us for their anger or tell us we made them feel guilty or say they only jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge because we told them to. Not sure if you'll remember that reference if you're around my same age. But the point is, people can try to put blame on whatever they want to us, but it's up to us whether or not to accept it. We're all responsible for our own emotions and behavior, which is also part of emotional intelligence. We need to be able to identify, express, and regulate our emotions appropriately and recognize that our emotions guide our behavior. People who make it more difficult for us to regulate our emotions are probably the ones we need boundaries for. Once we figure out what the boundaries look like, we need to implement them. We can go ahead and just start the boundaries, or we can talk to the person about it first. If we're setting boundaries in the hope that the other person changes behavior, then I recommend talking to them about it. Let them know what boundaries you're setting and why, because if we don't talk to them about it, they may not make the connection between their behavior and your boundaries. Doing this, though, can be challenging. I recommend taking some time to think about how you can effectively communicate your needs and how their behavior affects you, as opposed to accusing them of things that they're doing or not doing, pointing the finger, telling them everything they're doing wrong. Instead, focus on how it affects you. It's a perfect example of taking responsibility for your own emotions, which is exactly what we'll be asking them to do as well. So lead by example. Some people will respect our boundaries and others won't. But it's not about what they do or don't do. It's about us. If they don't respect our boundaries, then we have to implement them anyway. We don't have to wait for someone to give us permission to implement boundaries. And after we implement them, we need to enforce them. It's kind of like laws. Laws don't mean much if they're not enforced. Establishing boundaries disrupts the dynamic of the relationship, which isn't easy and it's often pretty uncomfortable. And this is why most of us don't do it. But maybe it can help to ask yourself why someone else's needs are more important than our own. They are the ones violating our boundaries. So why is it that we are the ones who struggle with fear or guilt over telling them that it's not okay to treat us that way? If anything, they're the ones who should be feeling badly about violating our boundaries. All we're doing is speaking up for ourselves. Just remember, when speaking up for yourself, it's important to do it with the same sincerity, compassion, and respect that we're asking them to give us. Again, lead by example. For your therapy homework, think about if there is anyone in your life that tends to violate your boundaries. Keeping in mind the path of least resistance, think about how you can tell them what you want from them, what you need from them. But I want you to also come up with some appropriate boundaries that you can set, just in case they ignore your request. When and if it's appropriate, be prepared to establish and implement your boundaries and enforce them. If you feel resistant to setting these boundaries, maybe there's fear or guilt there, I recommend exploring why that is and work on overcoming it. This is the end of this course on improving emotional intelligence. My hope is that it leads you to a higher EQ and a more satisfying life. Thank you for listening and allowing me to be part of your journey. I would love to read any feedback you have for me and in the course classroom so I can continue to create helpful, healing, and challenging courses. Thank you.